In 1883, in the heart of New York City, a man richer than most nations stood inside a house so large, so expensive, and so demanding that it would quietly begin to drain his fortune. This was not a criminal, not a gambler, not a fool. This was William Henry Vanderbilt, heir to the most powerful family in America. And this is the story of how a mansion, built to display absolute success, became a financial trap. Not because William Vanderbilt lacked money, but because no amount of money was ever enough. When people talk about the Vanderbilt family today, they imagine limitless wealth. Railroads stretching across continents, ships cutting through oceans, gold flowing faster than it could be counted. But history is rarely kind to illusions, because while fortunes are built in moments of ambition, they are often destroyed by something far more subtle: maintenance, expectation, pride, and sometimes a house. If you enjoy stories where wealth doesn't guarantee wisdom, stories where power quietly turns against the people who hold it, consider subscribing. This channel is about the hidden costs behind history's greatest successes. Because this story doesn't begin with failure, it begins with dominance. Before William Vanderbilt ever dreamed of marble halls and imported stone, there was his father, Cornelius Vanderbilt. Cornelius was not born into privilege. He clawed his way up from nothing. By the mid-19th century, he had become a force of nature, first through shipping, then through railroads. While others speculated, Cornelius controlled. While others hesitated, he absorbed. He crushed competitors without remorse and without apology. Not through elegance, but through efficiency. By the time he was finished, Cornelius Vanderbilt had assembled one of the largest private fortunes the world had ever seen. This was not old money. This was aggressive money, expanding money, unstoppable money. And Cornelius Vanderbilt made one thing very clear to his family: wealth was not to be enjoyed. It was to be protected, expanded, defended. Luxury was secondary. Power was everything. So when Cornelius died in 1877, he left behind more than money. He left behind pressure. Because inheriting the Vanderbilt fortune didn't make you powerful, it made you responsible. William Henry Vanderbilt was not Cornelius's favorite son. He wasn't the most charismatic, he wasn't the most feared, and he wasn't the most confident. But he was disciplined, cautious, and deeply aware of what it meant to carry his father's name. When William inherited the bulk of the fortune, critics were immediate. Newspapers questioned whether he could handle it. Rivals waited for mistakes. The public watched closely, because everyone wanted to know one thing: could William Vanderbilt live up to Cornelius? At first, the answer seemed to be yes. William expanded the railroad empire even further. He increased profits. He stabilized operations. On paper, he was doing everything right. But something else was happening beneath the surface. William wasn't just managing wealth. He was trying to prove himself. And in the Gilded Age of America, proof didn't come from balance sheets. It came from spectacle. The late 19th century was an era of excess without apology. This was a time when the richest Americans weren't just wealthy, they were experimental. They were inventing what wealth looked like. Money wasn't meant to sit quietly. It was meant to be seen. So they built mansions that looked like European palaces. They imported stone, art, and craftsmen from across the Atlantic. They filled rooms with gold, silk, and marble, not for comfort, but for comparison. Who had the largest ballroom, the tallest ceilings, the most extravagant staircase? In this world, houses were not homes, they were statements. And William Vanderbilt knew exactly what statement he needed to make. He could manage his father's empire, but could he surpass his legacy? Could he build something that would outlive him? Something that would say, without words, "I belong at the top." So William Vanderbilt made a decision that seemed logical at the time, even inevitable. He would build a mansion unlike anything New York had ever seen, not merely to live in, but to define his place in history. What William didn't yet understand was that this decision would never stop costing him, because the most dangerous thing about extreme wealth is not spending it once, it's committing to spend it forever. And the house he was about to build would demand exactly that. By the early 1880s, New York was transforming. What had once been a practical port city was becoming a stage, a place where wealth didn't whisper, it performed. Fifth Avenue in particular was changing fast. Townhouses gave way to palaces, brick gave way to stone, and restraint gave way to ambition. This was where America's richest families built monuments to themselves. The Astors, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, and now, the Vanderbilts. For William Henry Vanderbilt, Fifth Avenue wasn't just an address. It was a battlefield. Every new mansion that rose along the avenue raised the stakes. Every imported chandelier was a challenge. Every grand staircase was a silent provocation. William could not afford to build something ordinary. Ordinary would be interpreted as weakness. So he chose excess. The mansion William envisioned would occupy an entire block, not a townhouse, not a residence, a statement of permanence. Architects were given clear instructions: nothing small, nothing modest, nothing temporary. The materials alone told the story. Stone quarried and shipped at enormous cost, wood carved by European craftsmen, interiors designed to impress people who were already impossible to impress. This was not a house designed for daily life. It was designed for arrival. Rooms so vast they echoed, ceilings so high they dwarfed their occupants, corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly even when empty. And empty they often were. But that didn't matter, because the mansion wasn't built for comfort. It was built for comparison. When construction began, no one flinched at the cost. The Vanderbilt fortune was still massive, daily expenses barely registered. At the time, the final price of the mansion would reach several $1,000,000, an astronomical sum in the 1880s. Adjusted for today, the cost would soar into the hundreds of millions. And yet, that number only captured the beginning. Because a house like this doesn't end when construction stops. It only starts. Servants were hired by the dozens, then the hundreds. Gardeners, footmen, cooks, maids, maintenance crews. Entire lives were organized around keeping the mansion functional. Heating alone consumed staggering resources. Lighting had to be constantly maintained. Every surface demanded attention. Marble cracked, wood warped, fabric aged, and everything, absolutely everything, had to be perfect. Because perfection was the point. At first, the mansion achieved exactly what William wanted. Guests were stunned. Rivals took notice. Newspapers wrote in awe. The Vanderbilt name became inseparable from the image of unimaginable luxury. From the outside, William Henry Vanderbilt looked like a man who had won. But inside the house, a different reality was quietly forming. A reality built not on admiration, but on obligation. Because the mansion was never finished. There was always another improvement, another renovation, another upgrade to keep up with newer, grander homes. Status doesn't stay still. And the moment William stopped spending, the mansion would begin to look outdated, unforgivable. This was the hidden rule of extreme wealth. Once you raise the standard, you are trapped by it. And William Vanderbilt had raised it as high as it could possibly go. The costs became routine, so routine that they no longer shocked anyone. Thousands spent every week, sometimes every day, not on expansion, not on investment, but simply to prevent decay. The mansion consumed money without emotion. It did not care about market conditions, or public opinion, or long-term sustainability. It demanded attention, relentlessly. And slowly, subtly, the numbers began to shift. Not enough to cause panic, not enough to force action, just enough to create pressure. William began to realize something unsettling. His father's fortune had been built on movement, ships, railroads, trade. But this house was static. It did not generate wealth. It did not expand influence. It simply existed and demanded payment for the privilege. Still, selling it was unthinkable. To abandon the mansion would be to admit failure, to concede that the Vanderbilt name had limits. So William continued, paying, maintaining, preserving the illusion. Because in his world, appearances weren't optional. They were everything. And this is where the story begins to change. Because once the mansion became essential to William's identity, it stopped being an asset and became a liability. But the most dangerous liabilities are the ones that don't look dangerous at first. And the mansion still had years of influence left, years during which it would quietly, patiently drain more than just money. By the late 1880s, the mansion was no longer new. Its marble had lost the shock of first impression. Its halls were no longer whispered about. They were expected. And that was the problem. Because in a world driven by status, yesterday's miracle becomes today's baseline. What once symbolized limitless power now required constant defense. Every neighboring family renovated. Every new fortune tried to outshine the last. And the Vanderbilt mansion had to keep up. The expenses never stopped. They multiplied. Furniture imported from Europe aged quickly under heavy use. Fabrics faded. Walls cracked. Floors warped with seasonal change. Entire teams were employed simply to prevent deterioration. This wasn't luxury anymore. It was logistics. The mansion functioned like a small city, one that produced nothing and consumed everything. Heating the house in winter required enormous quantities of coal. Lighting meant constant maintenance of gas systems. Water systems failed regularly under the strain of size and usage. Every failure was urgent, because failure was visible, and visibility was unacceptable. At this scale, even minor problems became expensive. A broken fixture wasn't replaced, it was rebuilt. A worn carpet wasn't cleaned, it was discarded. Because restoring grandeur was cheaper than risking embarrassment. And so the spending continued, automatically, without question. William Vanderbilt was not reckless. That's what made this so dangerous. He reviewed numbers. He understood costs. But the mansion's expenses didn't arrive as a single dramatic crisis. They arrived as a rhythm, a steady, relentless rhythm that became part of life. And once something becomes routine, it stops feeling dangerous. The mansion demanded staff, and staff demanded loyalty. Dozens of people depended on the house for their livelihoods. To reduce expenses would mean dismissals, disruption, public notice. And public notice was the enemy. So the system remained intact. Gradually, William's fortune began to feel heavier, not smaller. He was still enormously wealthy, but his money was no longer free. It was allocated, committed, tied to an immovable structure. And unlike a failing investment, a mansion could not be quietly sold or restructured. It stood in plain sight, judging him. The psychological cost was just as real. William could not escape the house. If he left it, he was reminded of its expense. If he stayed, he was surrounded by it. Every room whispered obligation. Every corridor reinforced permanence. The house wasn't just a symbol of success anymore. It was a reminder of a promise he could never withdraw. And yet, abandoning it remained unthinkable. Selling the mansion would be interpreted as weakness, not just financial weakness, personal failure. Because in the Gilded Age, wealth wasn't measured by numbers alone. It was measured by what you could afford to maintain. Not once, forever. As the years passed, external pressures began to rise. Economic fluctuations, market uncertainty, increased competition. The railroads, once unstoppable, faced challenges. Profits slowed, not collapsed, slowed. But even a slight reduction in income can be catastrophic when fixed expenses remain massive. And the mansion's costs were fixed, non-negotiable. This was the paradox William Vanderbilt now lived inside. He was still one of the richest men in the world, and yet his margin for error was shrinking. The house had set a minimum standard of wealth he could never fall below. Not without consequences, not without humiliation. This is where fortunes begin to erode, not through catastrophe, but through commitment. The mansion didn't take everything at once. It took a little, every day, every month, every year, patiently. William had built a house meant to last forever. What he hadn't considered was whether his fortune could do the same. By the early 1890s, the illusion still held. From the outside, William Henry Vanderbilt remained untouchable. His name still carried weight. His mansion still commanded attention. But stability is not the same as security, and beneath the surface, the balance was shifting. The American economy was changing. Industries that once felt permanent began to feel exposed. Railroads faced new pressures. Competition increased. Costs rose. None of this was catastrophic, but it didn't need to be, because the mansion didn't care whether the economy was booming or tightening. It demanded the same resources regardless. What once felt like manageable excess now felt inflexible. William could no longer adjust his lifestyle without consequences. Every attempt to reduce expenses risked public scrutiny. Every visible change would be interpreted as decline, and decline, in his world, was worse than loss. The house had become a fixed symbol of power, and symbols must be maintained, even when they stop serving the people who built them. William had succeeded in proving himself, but success had locked him into an image he could never escape. There were moments, quiet moments, when the logic became impossible to ignore. The mansion was not an investment. It generated no revenue. It created no leverage. It existed solely to preserve perception. And perception, unlike money, compounds in only one direction: upward. William understood this. He was not blind. But understanding does not always lead to action, because action requires accepting consequences. And the consequence of change was humiliation. Selling the mansion would have been financially rational, but socially devastating. It would signal that the Vanderbilt standard had slipped, that the family who once defined American wealth could no longer sustain its own image. So the mansion remained, and the payments continued. The true cost of the house was no longer measured in dollars. It was measured in choices that could not be made. Flexibility lost, options narrowed. The fortune was still vast, but it was no longer free. William Henry Vanderbilt died in 1885, and when he did, the mansion did not disappear with him. It remained, demanding the same attention, the same resources, the same maintenance. The obligation passed on. His heirs inherited not just wealth, but responsibility, and the house was now part of that inheritance, an immovable anchor tied to a family fortune that would never again feel limitless. Over the following decades, the Vanderbilt empire slowly fractured, not because of one bad decision, not because of one economic collapse, but because of accumulated commitments, mansions, lifestyles, expectations. Each generation inherited structures that required more to maintain than they produced, and slowly the money began to leak away. The Vanderbilt fortune did not vanish, it dissolved. Through upkeep, through pride, through the refusal to adapt. And the mansion, once a triumph, became a symbol of that erosion. By the early 20th century, many of the great Vanderbilt homes were sold, demolished, or repurposed. Not because the family had become poor, but because even immense wealth has limits, especially when it stands still. And this is the lesson William Vanderbilt never intended to teach, that luxury, once built, becomes a contract, one that renews itself every day, whether you want it to or not. Today, it's easy to misunderstand the Vanderbilt story. From a distance, it looks like extravagance without consequence, like wealth so vast it could absorb any mistake. But history tells a quieter truth. The Vanderbilt fortune didn't disappear in a single collapse. It wasn't lost to scandal or stolen by rivals. It was spent, slowly, routinely, respectably, on things that were meant to last forever. The mansion William Henry Vanderbilt built still exists, at least in memory, in photographs, in descriptions, in the stunned reactions of those who once walked its halls. But the fortune that made it possible is gone, not because it wasn't large enough, but because it was asked to stand still in a world that never does. This is the paradox at the heart of extreme wealth. Money feels permanent when it's growing, but permanence is expensive. Buildings age, standards rise, expectations compound. And the moment wealth stops moving, the moment it becomes fixed in stone and marble, it begins to decay. William Vanderbilt believed he was building a legacy, and in a way he was, but not the one he intended. His mansion became a warning that luxury can outgrow its usefulness, that status can demand more than it returns, that wealth, no matter how large, is not immune to maintenance. The Vanderbilt family didn't fail. They adapted too slowly. They inherited obligations that made change painful and delay comfortable. And comfort, when paired with pride, is one of the most expensive forces in history. The mansion was never evil. It was never foolish. It was simply honest. It reflected the cost of keeping appearances at any price. Today, we build different kinds of mansions, companies too big to change, lifestyles too expensive to abandon, identities tied to symbols we can no longer afford. And just like William Vanderbilt, many don't realize the trap until they're already inside it. The house still stands in silence. Its halls no longer echo with ambition. Its rooms no longer impress rivals. It exists now as a reminder that wealth is powerful, but maintenance is relentless. And sometimes the most expensive thing you can build is something you can never walk away from. If you want more stories about power, ambition, and the quiet mistakes that reshape history, consider subscribing, because the most important lessons are rarely the loudest ones, and they often come from empty rooms.